Hey, I just wanted to talk about something today that's been on my mind for a while, and I think the BSA Gold Star, sort of the reviews that I've done on that in recent weeks, have sort of brought it to the foremost part of my mind again. Because this subject among motorcyclists seems to be a big bone of contention. Now, this is just my opinion, it's just the way I look at it, so, you don't have to agree with me or disagree with me. It's just my thoughts on the subject, and that is foreign entities or businesses buying old British or even American brand names. Back in about 2008, I needed a small TV for my bedroom. So I popped down to my local Comet. You remember Comet? They've gone now. And had a look at what they had on offer and what I could afford. And in the end, I purchased a small flat-screen TV, I can't remember the size, made by Polaroid. And I bought it because Polaroid is a name that I know and a name that I consider to be trustworthy. Even though Polaroid formerly didn't make TVs, they were a camera and instant film manufacturer. But the reasoning in my head was that obviously everything had gone digital now, so they'd had to diversify. Now, I wouldn't say that it was an outstanding TV. It was decent enough for the money, and after I'd bought it, when I did a little bit of research on that newfangled internet, I found that Polaroid had actually been bought out by a Chinese company. It was nothing really to do with the original Polaroid company. They'd just bought the name from an entity that had expired. And I think a similar thing had happened to the Philips electronics organisation, perhaps even Grundig as well. All names from my past that I remember as being quality brands faded into obscurity, become economically unviable, probably gone bust, and then some wealthy Chinese organisation had come along and snapped up the name. And then look at Hasselblad, possibly maybe not one of the most famous camera brands in the world. I think they were a Swedish brand, but they were famed for being the best cameras on the market, head and shoulders above companies like Leica that we now consider to be, the bee's knees. Hasselblad were the sort of holy grail of cameras for amateur and professional photographers for decades. And they're now owned by DJI, the drone manufacturers, the people that make the action cameras that I use, etc. The action cameras that this footage was shot with. Now, of course, the reason that this happened in both instances was that film was no longer a format that anybody uses. Everything had gone digital, they'd become irrelevant, and those two companies had failed to make the transition from film to digital. I'm not suggesting for a moment that in either case those companies were incompetent. The world changed, but their identity failed to be successful in that transition. Now, I haven't researched this deeply, but I'm presuming this is a phenomenon that's perhaps only sort of come about over the last, 60 to 80 years. Companies have always been sold on and bought out. I would wager it's at least been going on since Roman times. Human beings only live for so long, so if someone starts a business up, it's only going to have a lifespan of maybe 50 years unless they're extremely young when they started that business up, because we don't live that long. People die, people want to retire, so it's always been common practice to sell a going concern on, and quite often the original name will stay with that going concern. It's effectively sold and bought out unless there is a family member, a son or a daughter, that's willing to pick up the baton and carry on. And that does happen occasionally. There are a handful of companies that have worldwide recognition that are still owned by the original family that started them off, but they're few and far between. Now, the main brands that people that view this channel are sort of interested in are brands like Triumph, Norton, Royal Enfield, and more recently BSA. And the comments flood in every day in the comments section over those sort of, I don't know how many, 800 videos that I've got on, various brands and subjects. It's not a real Norton because it's now owned by an Indian company. It's not a real Royal Enfield because they're built in India. It's not a real BSA because Mahindra have just bought the name. It should be called a Mahindra. But if we use that logic, Triumph motorcycles shouldn't be called Triumph motorcycles. It should be a Blow Holmes Bonneville or Tiger or whatever model you're talking about. Because if you're using that logic, Triumph is just the same as all these other brands. The original Triumph, in fact, it wasn't the original Triumph. It had already changed hands several times. Finally closed its doors and stopped producing motorcycles in the early 1980s. Now, putting aside the sort of parts bin specials that were sporadically produced in small numbers, Triumph didn't produce a new motorcycle for well over 10 years until John Blow, as part of a property deal, bought the factory to build houses on, and at the same time acquired the name and later started up Triumph motorcycles. But for the majority of people, that's okay because John Blow was an Englishman, or is an Englishman, sorry. So that's okay, but it's not on for these Indian companies to be doing it. Now, that sort of smacks of racism to me. Blow is often regarded as a saint for resurrecting a brilliant old British name, but his Indian counterparts that are doing the same are evil and dishonest. It's an attitude that I find quite unsavoury, to be quite honest. And before I go any further, I will say that Indian viewers can be just as bad, but in a different way. So please don't take that last sort of example that I've given as being an excuse to play the race card. Because it grieves me that I have to deal with those sort of comments from either side on what should be a celebration of motorcycles on this channel, and they'll all be dealt with in exactly the same way that YouTube prescribes they should be dealt with. Now, the thing is, these wonderful British brands went the same way as Hasselblad and Polaroid and countless other sort of well-known brand names for the same reason. The world changed and they were unable to adapt to that changing world, with the exception probably of Royal Enfield, because their historic sort of status is very different to the other three brands. In fact, Royal Enfield motorcycles have been built in India longer than they were ever built in England. Yet one of the most commonly asked questions that I get is, Royal Enfield's been built in India now, as though it's a recent thing. Yeah, they've been building them in India since the mid-1950s, 70 odd years. So it's clear in a lot of cases it's just sheer ignorance on some people's parts. They don't realise the circumstances surrounding the re-emergence of Triumph in the early 1990s. And of course, the marketing that all of these companies undertake sort of portrays a continual production since 1901 or 1902 or 1903, sort of feeds that ignorance in that people think that, these bikes never went out of production. The thing is, these brands went bust because, the car became king. The public in Britain and America and on the European continent became more affluent. They didn't want motorcycles anymore, they wanted a car. And the customer base basically dried up. And on top of that, the little bit of the market that was left was well and truly filled by superior machines from Japan. And it's not just the customer base that changed or the availability of customers. Britain itself changed. We're no longer an industrial nation for various reasons. I won't go into them because we'd be here all day. Suffice to say, it's just not really economically viable to build a motorcycle, to build anything or manufacture anything in the UK anymore. And what little industry we have left, it is disappearing on a monthly basis. And historically, that's what happens to sort of all civilised countries. We don't really produce anything anymore. So countries like Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan took over from us. And those countries have or are going through a very similar transition. A lot of products are not built in Japan anymore. They build the products and manufacture the products in countries where it's cheaper to produce. A country industrialises, it becomes good at producing things, its population becomes more affluent, it becomes more expensive to produce things, and eventually you either go bust because you can't sell your products because they're too expensive, or you have to move production to a cheaper country. It happens to every civilization. 10 years ago it was China's turn, and to some extent that's still ongoing. Now it's India's turn, and 10 or 20 years from now India will find itself in a similar situation, and it'll be Vietnam's turn, or some country like that. It's just the way things go. Now, if you've got the cash and you've got the infrastructure behind you and you want to start a new venture, it's difficult to create a new name and then build up a reputation for that name. So the best option, as a lot of these companies see it, is to seek out an old name that is no longer in use, buy it from the current owners, and start producing in that name. We've seen this happen with Triumph, we've seen it happen with Norton, and now we're watching it happen with BSA. I mean, everyone thinks of Indian motorcycles. I mean, the company Indian has been a typically American company. They started off as being an American company, but let's not forget, back in the 50s and 60s, they were owned by Royal Enfield. And I can't actually remember the time span now, but for around about a decade, they were rebadging Royal Enfields as Indian. And then, the name was bought back by an American firm, and it became an American firm again. But the thing is, when these companies buy a brand like Norton or BSA, it puts the general public's nose out of joint because, we've got fond memories, shall I say, of those brands, and we see it as, new money doing the distasteful thing of buying a hot potato, taking a shortcut in business by buying this venerated name. But they're not really buying a hot potato, it's more of a cold rice pudding with mould on it, because these brands have such a bad reputation by now that there's virtually no brand equity left in them. Everyone laughed at John Blow when he resurrected Triumph, because he was the third company in a decade that had tried it, and the Triumph name at that point was very much a national embarrassment. Norton, historically, since the 1970s, has been a very similar story. And even the now mighty Royal Enfield has had more than its fair share of trials, tribulations and prejudice. And now, of course, we've got BSA motorcycles facing exactly the same. I mean, to my knowledge, no one's built a BSA motorcycle for 50 or 60 years, certainly not since the 1970s. But this company has legally purchased the rights to the name and the rights to build motorcycle, the rights to build a Gold Star motorcycle. Yet to a large extent, I'm getting very prejudicial comments in the comments section as to why they're not the real BSA, or it's not a real Gold Star. Well, it is a real BSA because they've bought the legal right to call it a BSA, and it is a Gold Star because they've bought the legal right to call it a Gold Star. And no amount of prejudice or wishful thinking is going to change that. Badge engineering, if that's what you want to call it, has been common in the motorcar industry for decades. The motorcycle industry has done it for decades. It's not something that has just started happening, it's been there for a long time. Royal Enfield rebadging Royal Enfield motorcycles back in the 60s as Indian motorcycles is a prime example. But the way I see it is, 20 years ago we had a choice. There was like BMW, to some extent Ducati, although again they were in and out of trouble for a long time. And we had the Japanese 4, and that was the only choice we had with motorcycles. And that is changing now. Our choice of motorcycles is getting bigger almost every year. And surely, as motorcyclists, that's something that we should welcome and be grateful for. It doesn't matter where it's been made or who it's been made by. For the first time in some 40 or 50 years, our choice of brands is getting bigger instead of getting smaller. And instead of watching the price of motorcycles continually go up and up and up until a modern day motorcycle is costing the equivalent of a house that we bought once back in the 1980s. We should be grateful that these countries are now turning out good quality motorcycles at a realistic, affordable price. Well, maybe not where Norton's concerned, but certainly where BSA and Royal Enfield are concerned. At least in both cases, the sort of brand history and heritage of those motorcycle brands are in good hands. They're mindful of the heritage, yeah, to some extent. They're profiting from it, but they're also being very sensitive to it. I mean, just think what could have happened to BSA if it had got into Chinese hands. The BSA Gold Star could well have ended up being a generic, old-fashioned 125 with a built under license Suzuki or Yamaha engine from the 1980s or 1990s. And whether it will actually happen or not, they do at least have plans to start building the BSAs here in the UK in the not too distant future. Now, people don't have to like the BSA Gold Star, they don't have to buy one, the choice is theirs, but I don't see the need for all this prejudice. And it's not just BSA, to some extent I still see it with Royal Enfield, although it's far better than it was 5 years ago. And bitching and moaning about them either in the comments section on my videos or on the various forums is not going to destroy them and make them go away. It reminds me of an incident when I was at primary school. I was quite athletic back in the day, believe it or not. And I was the fastest runner in our primary school. And I remember once on the school sports day, 100 metres race, kid called John Nelson, as I was overtaking him, he physically put his right arm out to stop me from passing him. He tried to physically hold me back. And when that didn't work, just at the last minute as we were about to cross the finish line, he stuck his leg out and tripped me up. And I went arse over tit. But I went arse over tit over the finish line before he did. I still won. Now, none of the adults, teachers or parents said anything to him about his behaviour. He apparently got away with it scot-free, but the kids saw it and they tormented him about it for months afterwards. In fact, he would still often get teased about it years later in secondary school. I don't think he ever truly lived it down. And that's sort of what this online prejudice reminds me of about Indian motorcycles. It's a sad state of affairs. Right, once again, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this and my other videos, and in doing so helping to support this channel. I really do appreciate it. I would also appreciate it if you would leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you're not already a subscriber. Now, you can help in other ways by subscribing to my Patreon page or hitting the super thanks button down below. Either way, it would be much appreciated. I would of course be back next week, so until then, please ride safely and I'll see you soon.